This is an interview with Dr. Deon Bakkes. And I have to say, even though this interview won't take the same conversational flow that you're used to in cryptocurrency, this was probably my favorite conversation about crypto, emotion, human behavior, biology, science that I've ever done. Prepare to look at crypto in a completely different way. So let's give it up for Dr. Deon Bakkes.
So first of all, could you just talk about your origin story into being so able to put models together? Like, how has that happened? It seems like a kind of interesting route.
Yeah, it's been a long trip. Basically, it's all got to do with my studies, right? My university training up through BSc, honors, masters, and then PhD, right? Because I learn a lot about science, mathematics, and obviously with a very biology focused approach. And the particular route that I took, I started off with an environmental science degree. I liked that because it was kind of a broad approach because it looked at a lot of different fields in the environment. Then eventually I specialized down into insects and evolutionary biology. But yeah, there's a lot of maths modeling involved, especially with my PhD. I got into a lot of linear regression type models, where you do corrections to, correction according to phylogeny. Phylogeny is the evolutionary tree of life. So there's a lot of that kind of modeling going on. And, throughout my studies, I also did a lot of we learned about ecological models like diversity indices and those kinds of things. So that got my head sort of in the right place to think about ecosystem. And I find it very interesting that all this crypto based, ecosystem is such a prevalent word, and emphasizes the fact that there is diversity in these interacting parts.
So yeah, the way ecosystem is used, the word ecosystem is quite interesting. What do you think in terms of when you have, I wonder if there's like biological reasons why some things fall off out of the ecosystem. Do you know what I mean? So like the reason
there's definitely
I'm thinking of this is because in our ecosystem, let's say the ISO 222 ecosystem for interoperability, there's a reason some assets don't make it because they fall off or they don't make it for different reasons. Because of my interest in the Fibonacci sequence as well for chart reading, I do think there's a biological source to all the things that happen, even in technology.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I got an interesting perspective on that. I would agree that it's biological, but I would say it's actually almost prior to biological. It's just logical, right? It has to do with the logic of the universe, okay? Logic of how things work. And that basically, one of those aspects comes down to selection, right? And selection tends to favor optimization. But the reason things would fall off, as you would say, the reason things would fall apart or be removed from any kind of functionality is just because they're not optimized to a kind of function. And that's where, you see that in natural selection in nature the whole time. You see populations are comprised of individuals. And if individuals are good at what they do, extracting resources, using resources, depending on what their function is in the ecosystem, if they're good at it, then they tend to get better at it through genetic time, right? And obviously in human space, we have more of a mimetic kind of approach. So it's more about ideas and that kind of thing, which is similar to genetics in the way that it works, but it's obviously different substrate, So I would say, yeah, that's why I like XRP from the beginning, because one of the main things, we can't go into a digital world where transactions take long. We can't go into a digital world where it's difficult to issue assets, and where it's like gate kept. So it has to be a public thing. So for me, all those things meet my criteria of whether it fits its purpose, whether it's got a good fit. And good fit is a term we use in statistics modeling a lot, but also in evolutionary biology. That's why I like to say it's biological, yes, but even biology follows the logic of reality. And so things that don't make sense with the logic of reality tend to eventually get sloughed off, basically.
So what kind of inspired not just like the model that you created, but also the purpose or the driver to create such a model?
Well, what inspires it? I think it's the idea of I mean, obviously the model is built around this allegory of a pipe. And what kind of inspires it is this idea that you've got the central resource, which is central, sure, on one level, but at another level, it's completely accessible anywhere. So in that way, it's decentralized, right? So it's kind of this interplay between centralized and decentralized. It's centralized in function. I like to think of water actually itself, right? Water as a resource is centrally important in biology because it's used in all organism biological processes. But at the same time, it's widely accessible because it rains almost everywhere on the planet, or water pools in many, many places. And in that way, the whole XRP model is greatly accessible because the internet is accessible anywhere where there's a, internet connection. But it's to be central in my view. It's to be central in passing resources around. And with regards to my specific model, I tried to think of that as, I don't know, this is hard to explain, but it's kind of like an abstract center, which is everywhere and nowhere, pipes coming from it, and that's the internet that connects things. And then the size of the pipe is how much of that central thing can go anywhere. So it's almost like, if you want to think of it, a dot with a whole bunch of lines coming out of it, like a sun, actually. That's actually a good comparison. Because the sun works in the same way. It's central in one place, but its light touches everything, And then that light is used for photosynthesis in plants, heating up bodies, all these kinds of things,
Yeah. And so
the maths itself, I mean, that's,
sorry, there was a delay there, so I cut in and I shouldn't have.
Go ahead.
You were going to say?
I don't remember. I was sort of still building it in my head, but the math itself, that's actually a very simple process in my model. It's just the numerator, so the value, the fluid or the light in that previous example that I mentioned, divided by however many things it needs to be spread amongst. In this case, that's the tokens, right? So very simple way to conceptualize the maths in my model is that it's the value divided by the volume, and those are both what's actively being traded. And then if you look at a more complex version of my formula, that's when you can bring in sort of total value of assets, total amount of XRP, and then you need to focus on ratios to find out how much is actually being used. You take that formula and then the prediction side of my model, the projection side of my model, that's where the exponential and rarefaction curves get involved. And that relies a lot on my ecological knowledge, especially with the rarefaction curve, because in ecology, there's a really great technique we use for sampling species in an area. So if you want to go see how many birds are in an area, for example, we did this in third year undergrad, I remember it. You would go to an area and you would note down all the birds you see, and you would do that a few times, and eventually you would start noticing there's fewer and fewer new birds, which means that the amount of new birds is beginning to saturate, it's beginning to plateau. And that means you're getting close to fully sampling that area. Completely 100% know all the species in that area, because then you'd have to wait, 1,000 iterations for that one little new species that you missed 999 times before. But the point is, that drives home this idea of saturation curves where there's this like asymptote that you can't break through. And for me, I think that makes a lot of sense with how people hold these assets and that kind of thing. So that draws a lot on the ecology side of things for the second part of the model, which is where the prediction is involved, which is based on the functions that you use. In that case, I'm talking about a rarefaction, which applies to the denominator of the general price formula. And then the value, that's obviously, you can think of it as exponential or linear growth. And that's just growth in FX demand, really. So basically how people are using it. Yeah. That's basically, if you have any more questions. I'd also like to just highlight, if anybody wants to take a look at the document, that the white paper that was released, take a look at Appendix 2, because those are my actual words. The stuff in the previous part of the document is kind of stylized and made presentable, but the more hardcore scientific explanation of what I've done is in Appendix 2 of the white paper. And I'd highly recommend anybody who's checking those pages out in particular also go into why the buyback may be useful from the perspective of setting a price floor, basically, because if you were to have this massive price increase followed by a massive sell-off, followed by a slower recovery, you'd need that sort of line of buy floor to stabilize so the dip doesn't get too drastic, kind of thing. Anyways, that's all in Appendix 2 of the white paper. I just wanted to highlight that.
I'll have that shown on the screen as you're talking about that. I found this white paper to be really controversial because there's some big numbers in there.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people misinterpret modeling and predictions, because they're not the same thing. And also the whole idea of fair market value and modeled value is also fair market value, which is what you were trying to get to the root of, and current value. That's that people weren't, I don't think, understanding that difference.
It's because it's new. I mean, it's new. It hasn't really been implemented at its full intended scale yet. So every thought is a shot in the dark. And see, this is the one thing where having my science background is very helpful for me. I've learned to be uncomfortable with uncertainty. A lot of people are not uncomfortable with uncertainty in life. Science is a constant process of, am I doing it right? Is this wrong? Is it going to work? Is that not right? What did I do wrong? All this kind of thing, right? So everything is a stab in the dark, and you need to, there's that great quote from Aristotle, which is, an educated mind is able to hold an idea without necessarily accepting it, entertain an idea without accepting it, something along those lines. But that's really that's really how I view what modeling is. You need to entertain a bunch of ideas and see how they work. And in some sense, that's really what the scientific method boils down to. If you think of the scientific method, the core principle that I've learned is consider alternatives equally. Okay. So if you can, I always try to visualize it. Imagine you got a bunch of plants around you. You want to water each plant equally and see which one grows. Maybe you're looking at different soil compositions or something like that, different parasite loads, who knows. But you want to water each plant equally. You want to give attention to each hypothesis, as the plant in this case. You want to give attention to each one equally and then just see what emerges, see what happens. Because otherwise, if I was to say, well, I'm going to water this one, but not that one, okay, that could be a control. But say you're going to say, I'm not going to water this one and this one and this one. And then you're like, well, why aren't they growing? Why is there nothing happening? Why is there nothing of value coming out? Well, because you didn't put effort into it. A lot of scientists, unfortunately, get caught up in that. It's basically biases that end up driving people's thinking. But you have to have a very open mind, but you have a very discerning mind when it comes time to evaluate. And that's sort of this mental flip that needs to happen when you're doing these stabs in the dark. You got to be open to any direction in the dark. But then once you've seen what happens, then you need to be very cutthroat about which ones stay, which ones go.
That's
where
interesting.
that natural selection thing comes in.
Yeah.
Logic, right?
Because, natural selection will do the data analyzing automatically. Like it'll analyze, this animal produced this amount of X of amino acids that kept it alive, whatever it was, under the same conditions. Yeah. So we're just going to use use that genetic pool. How do you apply that to your portfolio?
That's an interesting question.
Because it's quite difficult, almost impossible to relieve yourself of biases. Because, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think what I would say is spread a little bit around at first, and then see what grows, and maybe put more into those things that do well, but never forget about the potentials. So like I was quite lucky when the XRPL had its token explosion at some point. I think it was 2021. What I did is I took very little bit of money, very little bit of XRP, and I invested in a whole bunch of these little meme tokens and NFT projects and that, but always very little at a time, not too much. Kind of trying to make it as broad as possible, but very little amounts. I'd almost feel like, man, am I even putting enough into this to have something work? And what happened is 1 or 2 of them popped off and I made good profit there. The rest died or were scams because, the scams were intense during that time. And then I lost that money. But because I laid it out evenly and didn't go too extreme on either investment, the profits ended up outweighing the losses, simply because if you hit it lucky once or twice in an investment, that's good. Now, I don't know how that applies to things like stocks and that, because stocks obviously grow a lot slower. But I think the same principle applies, diversify, but in small amounts. It's managing risk, right? I mean, that's
I think that's where it kind of, I'm limited in that thought process, because I kind of hold the belief and the bias. This is where I'm letting bias come in. I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong.
As long as you're honest about bias, that's the thing. Bias can never be eliminated, but as long as you're upfront and explicit about it, that's another scientific principle.
Yeah. What I think the diversification argument, and then using that to inform your future decisions, I think that's a good move for slow growth and almost spreading wealth, spreading wealth out.
Yeah.
In a way, though, I go against that thought in thinking I'm not going for for long term here. Like, I'm not going for that slow progression up. I kind of want to start like a firework and then spread it all out afterwards.
But are you going to pick the needle in the haystack, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so, you said stab in the dark, and then my brain was thinking kind of like, okay, you can have stab in the dark, but then some people's eyes are better adapted to the dark. And then you can actually start stabbing at a shape, and there's you're doing better than someone over there who's not had the carrots. I don't know if there's any science.
And you know what? That comes from experience. You mentioned eyes better in the dark. That comes from experience, man, because experience teaches, and then eventually I learned, hey, these kind of projects, they look like they've got a solid team. The team's actually engaging like they're real human beings, and they're not engaging in scammer type language or not trying to make too big promises. Like, okay, I know that's good. I'll put it more in there, Don't disagree with that bias that you have. It's just that the two exist simultaneously.
Yeah.
With what I did with my little bit of XRP token investments, the one or two or three that I managed to rocket off on did really well. And that's basically that fireworks that you mentioned. But now I was never going to come in like some absolute maverick and be like, okay, well, that one's going to work. That one's going to work. And then boom, boom. I mean, come on. This is reality we're talking about. So you kind of, you got to cast out many nets, and hope that a few of them catch firework. Yeah, but I agree with you. Once you've made a lot of money, yes, then diversifying for stability, I agree with that principle entirely. But I tend to think, especially I didn't have a lot of money to start off with at all, So I thought, let me not go too crazy. Let me not chase the dragon, because that's what can easily happen. That's when it becomes like gambling. You chase the dragon,
Hey guys, I'm going to take a minute to tell you about Incogni, which is a tool that you can use online to secure your personal data. I must also say that this part of the video is sponsored by Incogni, so let me tell you a little bit about why it's so important. Did you know that data breaches escalated 68% in 2021 alone? And the chances are right now you have data out there on the internet that's being sold and being used. That's why you get those random emails that you think you haven't registered for come through to your inbox. Somebody has sold your data. This is where Incogni comes into play. And what they do is they contact these data brokers, act on your behalf to take your information off their brokerages. And any issues that come up along the way in that journey, they will also handle those things too. And all of that is done to make sure that your data remains private. I've been using Incogni myself, and it's quite interesting because I'm not really paying any attention to it, but I know that it's doing something for me in the background. So you can either not do anything and your data is public, or you can not do anything and your data is private. That's kind of how I'm viewing it. If you're ready to give it a go, there's a 30-day free trial. For my viewers, if you use the code LULU, you get 60% off when you buy an annual plan. You can find the link in the description. So if you want to stay protected and in control of your data, go to incogni.com/Lulu. That's incogni.com/Lulu, or click the link in the description. Back to the video.
Yeah. So I think
you make the dragon come to you.
Yeah, exactly. You have to be the bait for the dragon. I think that example's really, the stab in the dark thing is, I'm quite I have a wild imagination, so I visually think of things rather than.
Wonderful. I love wild imaginations.
So I kind of think like, if you're in the dark, you're given some genetic advantages. You might be more attentive to things on an emotional level. You see the reaction from people. You might be able to read sentiment. That I think would come down biologically. You'd be able to read sentiment better than someone else. You might be more emotionally perceptive. Other people can see better in the dark. That's just natural. Other people can differentiate between different sounds that happen in the dark to kind of guide there's so many different factors here that allow a stab in the dark to be a calculated guess or a calculated gamble.
And it's interesting because those factors themselves are diversified once again. So even the traits that we use to try and grow diversity are diverse in themselves. And the traits that tend to do better, like maybe the emotional reading sentiment, as you said, maybe in certain fields that will do better as opposed to being able to see in the dark or other one. And then that will get upregulated through the natural selection process.
Yeah, over time, everyone kind of fits into their slot of where they're kind of genetically gifted and more likely for success.
Yeah, it's basically, you drift into there, and it's a combination. I can go into a lot of detail about this, but I won't. I would suggest you read some of my scientific papers on that. The recent paper there, Young Bite Better, has got some musings on this, but basically it's a combination of drift and selection. So natural selection is what cuts and chooses, but drift is what causes things to emerge. So basically drift is the tree growing. It's just drifting off in different directions. And then natural selection says, okay, that one sucks. That one sucks. That one sucks. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's the two processes that need to happen simultaneously.
Yeah. That's a significantly smarter way of putting it than I had in my list. I read a book by Alex Hormozy, just some business guy, makes loads of business videos on YouTube. He always talks about being directionally correct. So we all have factors that we're running away from, and we have desires that we're running towards. And as long as you're like going that way past the horizontal line, you're progressing. And so you're just directionally correct.
I like that. I've always been very big on not necessarily having distinct goals in my life, but having a distinct direction. You know?
Yeah.
And my direction has always been, sort of trying to figure out how nature works, because nature, not just the trees and the nature reserves and things, nature's in everything. Like I say, it's bio is just an addition to the logic of the universe, and that logic, which is nature. I almost try to think of it in terms of, logic gates, right? So computers, you can apply the same principle because logic gates are how computers work, and they basically determine electrons flowing in this and that direction, whatever. So there's another thing of electron converging and drifting into certain processes, and the logic gate comes and then organizes them by basically pruning the direction that they flow in. But as long as you've got that directionality organized, then your electrons in the computer, for example, will flow in the right way. And it's the same with other things, Yeah. I've also got a wild imagination.
Good. That's what these conversations are supposed to bring out. So I've been fascinated with the Fibonacci sequence and actually the Fibonacci retracement tool that you can use on the trading, on the charts. I've often speculated that all it's doing is using biologically rooted formulas to show greediness and fear, or fear and greed. Is it fear being the sale, greed being the buy?
Yeah.
Do you think there are other factors in there that make that such a relevant indicator?
Well, the way I see it, now I don't know too much about the Fibonacci sequences and that kind of stuff, but it's all about fractals, right? And from my conception of the universe, what I've managed to figure out is that they are at various levels of organizational complexity. So whether you're talking about quantum, through to molecules, through to organs, through to organisms, through to ecosystems, planets, universes, galaxies, whatever, there's always an interplay between these two factors. It's called a duality, right? In your case that you mentioned, it's greed and fear. So it's kind of giving and taking. They're opposites. You can think of it light and dark, good and evil, even if you want to. But there's this common thread that unites all of those levels. And that is where this fractal reflection comes in. And I feel like the Fibonacci sequence taps into that fractalness, right? Because if you think about it, trees tend to grow with their outbranching, their bifurcating branches. They tend to grow in the same, not exactly the same, but in similar manners where you've got a root point, because Fibonacci starts with 1 and then 2, I think, right? And then it goes up to 3 and then 5 and 7 or whatever the next. So it starts with this sort of germ point, and then things just start to creep out from that. And that's how a lot of things work, because that's the same way evolutionary trees tend to grow. It's the same way that populations tend to expand throughout geographic ranges. It starts off with one point. It's the same way that alleles and genes will also spread through a population. It starts with a germ point, and then it gets more plentiful and more plentiful. So I mean, I don't know about trading strategies. I suppose, yeah, it makes sense with trading strategies because in this case, the thing that you're talking about, the carriers of that fractal sequence are the people that are making these decisions. And then each person has that trade-off to make, that trade-off decision to make, which would be between the fear or the greed.
Yeah. And then over a longer duration of time, you kind of, the Fibonacci, because you can do short-term fibs on the chart. And that to me would generally indicate that less people are trading in that short period of time, obviously, just because of the constraint of time. And so if there are big moves or lots of greed in the market and in sentiment during that short space of time, then the price of that asset will increase or decrease depending on the decision, but only to the degree to which it's acceptable biologically. So there can only be so much greed, and there can only be so much fear within that short time period with those constraints.
Until you move up to the next level, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And then,
okay, that makes sense.
And so when you spread it over a long period of time, like when you draw the Fibonacci over a 4-year time period, you've basically got the average of all of the emotions during that time period. And at specific time periods, at certain price levels, there will always be a certain percentage of greed and a certain percentage of fear. And that plays out according to the lines that are put there by that sequence.
And there's obviously also external stimuli, right? Because in this, if we're going to use the example of a tree that's growing that we related to the asset price, you would have a tree that's growing according to a Fibonacci sequence. So that's like an internal process, but then the external processes might affect that growth, right? So you could have some unforeseen event and then suddenly, your tree shrinks and then it's no longer aligned to the 1, 1, 3, 5, whatever Fibonacci sequence. Now it's shifted a bit because it had some to start off with. And now it's sort of restarting that germ from that point because of the external process. So that interplay is another set of these dualities, like in the fear and greed comparison, right? So, and that external reality has its own, that interplay between the external and the internal factors. They have their own fractal, or they have their own thing that they're playing according, their own wave, right? So what I like to think of everything in reality as sort of like a wave. What I like to think is that life itself is a slow moving wave. So if you've got a drop that lands in water and you've got this thing that expands, and then if that drop increases in size, it goes bigger. But before it goes bigger, it first recedes. If you have a drop in a bucket of water, perhaps, right? The ripples go out to the edge and then they come back and then eventually they go back. And if there's a growth, drive for growth in that process, then eventually the expansion will breathe out and get larger and larger. The opposite is true. And that would be the fear thing, right? In your trading strategy. And then I guess your asset price would decrease. But the point is it always grows in this fluctuating kind of way, where it's like, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or the reverse. If we're walking backwards, that would be 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 1 step forward.
Yeah. And that's market cycles. That's everyone feeling the way they feel. They go through good times, bad times.
Same with genetic alleles, right? Because if you've got one innovation in a gene that is able to do something beneficial for an organism, and then it's able to transmit those genes go out, and then they wait for a bit, maybe for the next life cycle to take over. Then they recede while that's happening, and then they go further into the population if they still remain beneficial. So it's interesting to me how all these things can be conceptualized in the same way, and that just exemplifies the whole fractal connection. I like to think of it as like a golden thread that runs through all the scales of complexity in reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And that resonates with me quite a bit, actually. Right on my wavelength here.
Oh, weird.
But also, now I think about it with, you can have those external factors that play into the natural growth of something, that internal process.
The SEC case, that's quite an external factor.
Yeah. So that's what I'm talking about. So time and time again, when you look at the Fibonacci moves on the chart, you can often see when news is going to happen.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
So we call them the retracement levels. At the top retracement level, it's the 4.236 levels. I guess that's 426%, or whatever it is, converted to golden ratio numbers. That typically over a long period of time is the limit for a positive move in the market. And so it's not in price, that is a limit in the amount of greed that can possibly happen.
That makes sense. Yeah, I like thinking in terms of limit. That's good to conceptualize it that way, I think.
But you can also make the exact same argument and say, well, actually, there's a level that was made famous, I guess, by this guy called Blockchain Bakkes. He's a genius at Fibonacci.
Oh, I know Blockchain Bakkes, yeah.
So he uses the 702 level, the 0.702. And if news is ever going to happen, it always happens around that level. If not, when it touches the 702. That is fascinating because it shows that over a certain periods of time with certain price action, with certain combinations of greed and fear combined with a bigger greed and a smaller fear, perfect combinations of those react as a whole at certain levels on the Fibonacci scale.
And that makes sense because if we're talking about the speculative market, right, which is driven by greed and fear, as news would come out, I don't know if you've heard of the 100th monkey effect.
No, tell me.
So basically they've done, I can't remember who did the study, but there's been a study done ages ago where they took a population of about 100 monkeys and they taught they isolated them from the rest of the monkeys in the world and they taught them a new skill. And roughly once about 100 monkeys learned the skill, then suddenly that skill started being practiced by distantly related monkeys or distant monkeys that weren't in the same geography, right? So there could be something that's some kind of information that's spreading through, the monkey consciousness, if you want to call it that, without getting too woo-woo here. But there's something like that. And I think that may be the same thing may transmit fear and greed in the same way, And then just to put my little spin on it, obviously the XRP utility would be another external factor that would influence that internal Fibonacci process, because just as the SEC case was an external factor that caused the price to, be crunched down and limited and all that kind of thing. Once XRP finally gets utility, once everybody realizes that there's kind of no other alternative to the world's financial system, just putting that out there, that external utility is going to drive price in such a way that we also can't predict, but it's still going to have that internal core of the Fibonacci driving the internal processes. It's just that the external could bump that up to the next level, right?
Yeah. Or limit it. So yeah, either way.
Limited. But I don't know. I tend to think that I think once XRP gets utilized, there's only so much to go around.
Yes, exactly. It purely comes down to supply and demand. We know it's going to be demand, and we know there's a limited supply. So that's a good combo. I do wonder though, if there is such a thing that is a utility environment separate to a speculation environment. Are there any kind of ecological comparisons you could make to where that actually even happens?
Not really, because animals, as we know, don't necessarily function off of free will. They function off of instinct, right? So I would put that in the utility category because it's very deterministic, very circumscribed. This will happen because of X, Y, Z. I think speculation would be down to humans' free will, right? What makes it interesting is I think we have the two processes happening at the same time, you know, or we will eventually once things start getting used. And that will make it very interesting. I think the way I see it is that the utility and the external factors will then set a baseline, either the limit or floor. And
like a point of no return.
Yeah, exactly. And then the speculation, which would be the free will will cause fluctuation. I mean, so you can still do trading, and obviously that's what XLS30 is going to be able to allow people to make profits from the volatility, as David Schwartz said. And I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch unfold, because once again, we're talking about two things happening simultaneously.
Yeah. And also it's scary right now to the idea of there being a set price or a floor price is strange to think about right now, but also it's completely contextual to the situation we will be in. So let me explain that. So right now, a $10 fluctuation in XRP is like the craziest move ever. At $10,000, a $10 fluctuation
is nothing.
Yeah. And we have to think about that as well. Like it won't
be the same with Bitcoin, you know, the same thing happened with Bitcoin.
Exactly. It won't be a flat price. There will still be speculation influences, external influences on the price because people hold it.
Yeah.
But that floor price set by the instinct, the utility of the asset keeps it up there.
Yeah.
And for all intents and purposes at that point, it's stable.
Yeah. And that's why the best strategy is ultimately to hold long-term through all of that. That's my core investment strategy, is just buy and then busy myself with something else. That's why I do science and music and all these kinds of things, you know, because I don't really like to engage in trading. I find it fascinating because of the comparisons and scientific models, but I would probably mess it up, you know. So that's why if you just hold for a very long time, that usually pays off, because you accumulate the good days and then the bad days tend to wane in comparison if you accumulate the good days.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was probably one of my more enjoyable conversations. I never get to talk science and nature and stuff. I love it so much. Thank you for all of your contributions. If anyone hasn't seen the model that was created, it's well worth a look, but I'm sure everyone's seen that big document. It's just nice to see the people behind the models. Thank you very, very much for your time. And I hope we get to speak again soon.
Thanks, Lewis. Yeah, it was great chatting to you.
Thank you.